So, welcome everybody to Ansible 101 for the Windows SysAdmin. I'm Josh King. I don't have an About Me slide today because, like I said, I am up against time. So, just really quickly, if you do want to reach out to me, I'm available on Blue Sky and Mastodon. And those will be, I'll have those again at the end. I'm a infrastructure ops engineer at Chocolatey, and a lot of my day job now is Ansible. So, I've been enjoying it. Before we crack in, though, do take a minute to thank. I do want to take a minute to thank our sponsors because without them, this event doesn't happen. So make the most of them being out there. Yes, I did start slightly early. Make the most of them being out there. Have a chat with them. Grab some swag. Although it's getting towards the end, so it might be a bit slim pickings out there by now. So, what is this talk? Well, last year I did a 90-minute session on adding Ansible to your Windows infrastructure toolkit. And in that talk, we spun up some VMs. If I remember correctly, we did that in Azure. We configured them, applied a hardening baseline to them, installed some software with Chocolatey. But that talk assumed you already at least had Ansible running and had a sort of a baseline of knowledge there. And some of the feedback I got on that was, well, how do I get to that point? So the point of this talk is effectively to take what I'm assuming to be a almost exclusively Windows sysadmin and getting them to the point where they can just go into that next last year's video and follow through with the demos there. That is going to require a little bit of Linux and, of course, Ansible. So to start with, what is Ansible? And this slide is ripped directly from last year because as much as I tried, I couldn't find a better way of explaining it. So there's the concept of infrastructure as code, which, of course, is codifying your infrastructure so that you can potentially redeploy it or basically reproduce that infrastructure. Now, that concept, infrastructure as code, can be broadly split into two sections. You've got infrastructure provisioning, which is sort of like your hardware, even if it's virtual. So those could be spinning up virtual machines, creating virtual networks, deploying firewalls, app gateways, that sort of thing. And then there's configuration management, which is actually configuring that infrastructure. So that could be creating firewall rules, it could be deploying software, anything like that. On the infrastructure provisioning side, you've got tools like Terraform, Pulumi, AWS CloudFormation, of course, you've got ARM templates and Bicep now. And on the configuration management side, you've got tools like Chef, Puppet, SaltStack. And Ansible sort of straddles the middle. It's a set of tools that enable all of infrastructure as code, and it does an okay job at infrastructure provisioning. It does an okay job at configuration management. Maybe not as good as those dedicated tools, but it does a good enough job that I've so far been able to dedicate to learning one tool and covering the whole spectrum of infrastructure as code. So it's really allowed me to dive deep into Ansible rather than having to spread my learning across a couple of tools. Before we get into it, before we get into the demo, some important concepts. Ansible runs on a Linux host, which is why we need to have a little bit of Linux in our back pocket because we are going to be touching that. And to achieve that requirement, you could use Windows Subsystem for Linux on a Windows box or run a full VM or run bare metal Linux. I personally go for a full Linux VM, but that's just because I use VMware Workstation and turning on the WSL stuff kills some of the things I need out of VMware. So I sort of don't have a choice. Your configuration code is going to be written in YAML, your playbooks and the like. So you're going to be dealing with a lot of indents. indents are going to become very important to you as you dive into YAML. And generally speaking, commands are executed on the target host. So say you've told Ansible, I want to create a directory. It goes and connects to that machine, creates the directory, and effectively in the Windows world, it'll be running PowerShell on that host to do the to create the directory. And of course, there's exceptions to every rule. Say, for example, you are provisioning infrastructure in AWS or Azure or whatever. There's nothing there yet to connect to. So your local host itself generally will connect to those services with the APIs and issue the commands needed to spin up that infrastructure. And there are ways in Ansible to delegate where commands are run. So you could say, hang on, no, I want this command to run locally, or I want it to run on this other host, even though it's not the one I'm currently configuring. And Ansible's Linux first, and we're going to see that in a bit, but that does mean if you're Googling for help, be very specific that you're looking for Windows Ansible help, because otherwise you're going to end up down a rabbit hole that potentially doesn't apply to you. So this talk is about Ansible for the Windows SysAdmin and specifically managing Windows. So I use Windows, by the way. Ansible requires WinRM connection between your Ansible server or that Linux VM and the target that you're managing, the Windows target that you're managing. SSH is possible, but it's still marked as an experimental feature, and I haven't used it yet, so I can't vouch for it. WinRM's just worked for me, so I haven't bothered to put too much time into investigating SSH. There are lots of auth options. Today we're going to be using NTLM in the demo. There is also Kerberos, there's basic auth, there's certificate, if I remember correctly, and of course those are all listed in the docs. And like I said, Ansible's Linux first, which means they had to distinguish the Windows commands. So by convention, the commands in Ansible that target Linux are prefixed with win underscore. So for example, there's a command called copy, which you use on Linux hosts. If you want to do the same thing on Windows, you use win underscore copy. I've got my own little protest against that in my own Ansible code, but I won't go down that rabbit hole here. So let's demo. I believe I promised in the abstract for this that we're basically going to go from nothing to running Ansible. So this, I'm connected to a newly installed Linux box. Doesn't have Ansible installed, and we're going to get it installed, set up, and managing a Windows box. So Ansible needs Python, and the current version of Ansible requires Python 3.10 through 3.12. This operating system, I'm running Rocky Linux here. It doesn't, well, actually, let's just have a look. The version of Python running on it's 3.9. And if you were to just try and update Python, it would just try and update to the latest version of 3.9. If I want a newer version of Python, I have to specifically go and get that specific version. And at the moment, or at least when I was writing this demo, I couldn't go all the way up to 3.11 without like compiling it myself or grabbing it from somewhere other than the official repo. So I'm going to go and install Python 3. Sorry, I'm not sure which Python version I said. I'm going to install 3.11. 3.12 is not available yet. So using my system's package manager, DNF, I'll go and install the Python version that I need. So I'm specifically calling out, I need 3.11. And the only reason I know 3.12 is not available is because when I tried to ask for it, it said it can't be found. So, and Python's one of those tools that you can have multiple versions installed and they'll happily live side by side, and as we'll see here in a sec, actually. So if I look at the Python version now that that's been installed, hey, it's still 3.9. That's not what we want. And if we look specifically at Python 3, still 3.9. Now, we could change where these are effectively aliases pointing at a version of Python. We could change these to point to 3.11, and then everything that called PowerShell would then use that version, but that could potentially break things. So instead, I'm going to specifically call 3.11. And if I do double dash. So I'm specifically going to call the 3.11 executable. Now, there's multiple ways to install Ansible. You can install it from your systems via your systems package manager like Python there, except it's generally going to be an older version of Ansible. And if you're using a Linux distro like this one, it's going to be very old. So regardless of the distribution for Linux, I prefer installing it via the Python package manager pip. That it ensures I always get the latest version available. The problem is I don't have pip installed. So we'll go and grab that really quick. And luckily, the command is very similar to before. I'm just basically grabbing the pip module for Python, specifically the 3.11 version of pip. And that's done. So now I can install Ansible. And I do that now that I've got pip installed by using the pip module of Python. And I say install Ansible, and I'm going to install this to my user scope because I do. So this should be nice and quick. Just while it is going, I'll point out, so it is installing Ansible. Then there's also Ansible Core, which is the core sort of functionality of Ansible itself. There is Ginger 2, which is the templating engine, which in my opinion is where the real power of Ansible comes from, is that. And I wish I had more time to dive into, I believe I said the same thing last year, I wish I had more time to dive into Ginger, but there's other things to look at. So we've got Ansible installed now, and we can test that it's working by running Ansible itself. And similar to Python, we're going to call a user module called ping. And we'll do it against localhost. And when we do this, it says, there is a warning up there that says no inventory was passed, so I can only target localhost at the moment. But it did report back the success, and I got a pong on my ping. Now, this isn't like an echo request. It's not just saying, hey, this thing's on the network. It has actually connected to, in this case, localhost, and verified that the connection for Ansible is up. Now, I use the word module there, and there's dash where the command says -m ping. In Ansible, you can roughly think of modules. I'll probably be using the word command from here on out. But modules, you can think of them roughly like functions or commandlets in PowerShell. They are the things that you call to execute a task. So there's a file command you would use in PowerShell, say new item. They're sort of roughly equivalent. And then these modules are then effectively shipped within collections. And not to confuse things, collections in Ansible are like modules in PowerShell. These are the things that contain multiple commands, and you use those to ship those to other people and share them and consume them. And there's a bunch of these collections that have been installed by default. Collections. list. That command that I run, Ansible-Galaxy, is the command you use to manage collections. You can install new ones via that. And the name of it comes from well, I'm not sure which came first, but there's a repository online called Ansible Galaxy, which is effectively like the PowerShell gallery. That's where collections are hosted and you can consume them from there. But this is quite an extensive list of collections that have been installed by default. So we can see there's some AWS stuff in here, there's Azure, there's of course some Windows commands. Chocolatey does maintain a collection as well, and that's installed by default. There's a whole host of community stuff in here, including a community Windows collection. And yeah, the list goes on. There's Google Cloud in there, all sorts. I was planning on having a second screen, but I didn't bring it, so I'm working out of a notebook. So we've got Ansible installed now, effectively. Our Ansible box, yeah, it's installed. It can technically connect to things, but our Windows box isn't ready to be connected to. So the first thing I need is a user. So let's go ahead and create a new local user. No, there. I'm calling this user Ansible. You can name it literally anything. I'm just calling it Ansible because I'm not feeling very creative at the moment with my naming, and you'll see that when you see the name of this Windows box as well. Password never expires. There we go. Give it a password. All right, created our user. Now this user is what Ansible is going to connect to this box as. So it's going to need whatever permissions are needed to carry out the task that you want Ansible to carry out on that machine. If you're installing software, that probably means it's going to need some sort of administrator type credential. For my demo here, I'm going to be just adding it to the local admins group. You may want to create your properly scoped group in production that this goes specifically into and has just the permissions it needs. So do what I say and not what I do, I guess. So I'm adding it to the local administrators group. It's always one of those words that I can't type on demand. Well, it didn't complain, so I must have typed it right. So that account's ready to go now, effectively. But I still need to prep this machine for having a remote connection. Now, Ansible does supply a script to set this all up, and that's what I'm going to use today. In theory, you can get away with just doing WinRM quick config should get you most of the way there for a lab environment where you don't need certificates or SSH or anything. What their script does is, it's quite a big one, all things considered. Let's blow that up just a little bit. There we go. So it has a bunch of comments right up the top. One of the most important ones is the script is going to generate a self-signed cert. And like it says there, that's intended for development environments. In production, you would want to use a CA signed cert. And there's also a bunch of other options in here that you may want to consider for your, if you're setting things up in production. For my demo environment though, I'm just going to run it. So this script is, like I said, in the documentation for setting up a Windows host from Ansible. And there's a link to that and some resources that I've got at the end of the slide deck. So now we're ready to connect. If I now go back to, oh, actually, I did say, you'll see what the name of this box is. I was very creative this time around. Right, so we saw before that warning saying that there's no inventory available. So the first thing we're going to need to do is basically tell Ansible about the host that it's going to be, that it's going to be managing. So I've created a folder for my demos. Ignore playbooks there. As I said, I was up against time, so I've pre-populated that instead of making you watch me type for a couple of minutes. Because stuff like that happens. So I've created a folder called inventory, and in there, that's just a convention. The folder could be named anything. And I'm going to make a host file in there. Now, this inventory can take the form of an ini or config file, or a YAML file. And because basically everything else is going to be YAML, I stick with YAML for my inventory as well. Now, in this file, you list groups, and then you assign hosts to those groups as well. Your hosts are always going to be a member of two groups. They are automatically assigned to a group called all. So that's literally just how you can address all of the machines in your estate, or at least the ones in your inventory. And then they're also a member of either the groups you've defined, or if you've listed them in here without assigning them to a group, they go into an ungrouped group. I'm pretty sure the name of it's ungrouped. I've never actually used it because of how I fill this out. I literally can't have a host that's ungrouped. So my first group, just because I want to list everything that's in my lab here, I'm going to call Linux servers, and that has two hosts. There is Ansible, and there is Nexus. Nexus is just a box that I've got here, basically shielding me from any Wi-Fi issues. So it's already pre-cached all of those things I've been installing, so I don't have to stress about the Wi-Fi going down. Then my second group is, of course, Windows servers. Now, groups can have child groups in there, groups can have child groups. Hosts can belong to multiple groups. So, like, I've got Windows and Linux here. You could have, say, AWS hosted, Azure hosted, on-prem, whatever, however you need to group your things together. And then you can target your commands appropriately. So now that we have an inventory defined, if I've typed everything correctly, I should be able to go back here and say, actually, make things easier on myself. Let's go into that directory. I should be able to say, go and target all of my Linux servers. Inventory. So the -I is me telling Ansible where that inventory that I've created is. And it needs to know specifically that file that contains the list of groups and hosts. And what we'll see here is two things. It's successfully connected to Nexus. We can see that down the bottom here. It did ask me first to accept the key from that server because I haven't connected via SSH from Ansible to my Nexus box yet. But it did now fail to connect to itself, and that's because it's trying to use SSH, and because of how I've set up my lab, it couldn't resolve its own name, and I don't think it could even get a SSH session up to itself. So we need to tell Ansible how to connect to Ansible now. Now we can add variables into this file, but as you can imagine, if you've got a huge inventory, adding variables to the mix here can make things quite busy. So instead what we can do is we can create two folders, host vars and group vars. Now, in these directories, if you create in group vars a file with the .yaml extension that has the name that matches a group, it will apply whatever variables are in that file to hosts under that group. And same with hosts. If it matches the name of a host, it'll apply those variables to that host. And the order of precedence there is, say you've assigned some variables to the all group. Those can be overridden by a more specific group. And then if you specify host variables, those will override it as well. And then there's a couple of other ways of overriding further down the chain, but we're not quite there yet. So in this case, I need to tell Ansible how to connect to my Ansible host. And this is Ansible connection. So there's a bunch of variables that tell Ansible how to do its thing, and they all start with Ansible _. This one tells Ansible how to connect to the machine, and I'm telling it this is a local connection. So now, if I go back here and run that, now it can connect, because it's not trying to SSH into itself now, it's just doing it locally. But we're here about to learn about managing Windows. So let's look at pinging our Windows servers. Now you notice this is taking a while to come back. What it's doing is it's trying to connect via SSH to that box. And it should come back in a moment saying, no, I can't get an SSH connection up. So same thing, we need to tell it, no, actually, this is a Windows box. We want you to connect with WinRM. Now, this is going to be something that applies to all of our Windows servers. So instead of doing it specifically for that host, we will do a group vars file for all of our Windows servers, if I can type it right. .yaml. Ansible connection to start. So, of course, we're connecting via WinRM. And because this is a lab environment, WinRM server, sorry, this is a long one, validation. It does have the self-signed cert there, and I don't want that to cause issues, so I'm going to tell it to ignore any cert validation stuff. Of course, in prod, if you're using CA cert, you wouldn't want to do that, obviously. But we do it here. Then Ansible, WinRM, transport. So this is where we tell it what auth mechanism we're using. And of course, I mentioned we're using NTLM. If you're in a domain environment, you'd probably use Kerberos instead. And then Ansible, WinRM scheme, HTTP, and Ansible port. No, 5985. So 5985 is the well-known HTTP port for WinRM. If you left out this line and were using this port, Ansible would be able to infer that you wanted to use HTTP. And if you change that to 5986, which is the HTTPS port, it would infer that you wanted HTTPS. The reason why I do the belts and braces thing here of specifying the scheme is because if you're behind a NAT and you change the port, suddenly Ansible doesn't know what scheme to use, and it throws some very cryptic error messages at you. And the fix for that is on my boss's blog, and I keep finding myself there. So I put it in here, and I never have to think about it again. And I can override this stuff in a host file if I need to. So now let's go back and try and ping a Windows server again. No. So Ansible now knows it needs to use WinRM. It's gone to Python and said, please use WinRM. And Python's gone, I don't know. So we need to even though Ansible's been installed with all of those collections and stuff that allow management of Windows boxes, the same isn't true of Python. So we actually need to install a Python module that allows that. So we are going to install PyWinRM, which is the Python module that supports WinRM. There we go. Now, we connect, but of course, we need a username. So let's go and add that for specifically our Windows box. And that variable is Ansible user. And if you remember, we just called it Ansible. Right, but of course, we've got a username, now we're going to need a password. Rather than putting that in the file and potentially saving it as clear text, I'm going to tell Ansible, actually, ask me for the password. And remember I said Linux first? It's assuming the password I'm asking for is SSH. So ignore that prompt and give it the password anyway. Now, this is where we circle back to what I said in the slides, with Ansible being Linux first. We're using the ping command. That doesn't work on Windows. So what we've got here is output from Python saying, hey, I tried to run this thing and it didn't make any sense. So, well, actually that's still back in my console. So instead of ping, we want winping. And all going well, we get our Pong response back. So now our connection is up between Ansible and our Windows box. I did sort of draw that out a bit because I wanted to go through the process of, iterating through that. Of course, if you go and redo this at home or at work, you can just skip straight to the point and put all that stuff in your inventory and, you're done. The key thing is, if you're installing Ansible, just remember to install that Python package. Oh, I am well ahead of myself in my notes. So I did want to cover Ansible, the Ansible config file, but it got axed because I needed some extra time. So we're going to skip ahead and start looking at playbooks. So far we've been running ad hoc commands on the command line, just calling Ansible saying run this module against this server. All right. Now we want to go into the playbooks that I said to ignore for now. So a playbook is basically think of it like a script file in PowerShell. You specify the commands you want to run, it's going to run through them. You can do things as you get more into this of looping. You can do conditional statements to say, only run this task if this other thing's true. You can capture the output from things. You can do all sorts in here. Of course, we're starting simple for today. So the first thing in a playbook, you can give the entire play a name, but I don't know why I don't, but I just tend to skip that. So the first thing I do is specify which hosts this playbook is targeting. So of course, in this case, that's my Windows servers. And what I want to do is create a directory on potentially all of my Windows servers, but this lab environment just has the one, on the C drive called tools. And that's using this winfile command or module. And the way I've done it here is sort of like the fully qualified way of addressing a module or a command in Ansible. So this ansible.windows is the collection that module is coming from. And you'll see the command below it's also coming from that module. You could just specify the module and it should figure out what you're wanting to run. I've run into situations where I've actually had multiple things providing the same module, but they're coming from different collections. So I've just gotten into the habit of being verbose when I'm doing my playbooks. And then just a note on the state thing. In Ansible, the state is normally absent or present. Of course, present means make this thing appear there or be in this way, and absent means potentially delete it or undo whatever you did to put it there. Because WinFile does multiple things, you have to tell it that you want to create a directory, otherwise you're going to get a tools file sitting there on disk, which doesn't really help us. Then what we're going to do is we're going to use the WinCopy command to copy a file into that directory. And by not specifying a file name on the destination, we're saying keep the original file name. Now that file is, I've just pointed to it relative to where this demo file sits, so it's under Files. And in here, these curly braces are basically saying that I want the variable name, so in this case company name, to be substituted for that entire thing, starting and ending at the final curly brace. So let's define those variables, because they aren't defined anywhere yet. So we've got company name and machine type. And these can apply to everything in our estate. We have company name, and we'll go with example Inc. And we had machine type, if I remember correctly. And we're just going to say virtual machine. Okay, but maybe I don't want my Windows box to say virtual machine. I want it to say type. So what we'll do in the host vars is say, well, actually, this is a Windows Server 2019 box. All right, where's our demo? And just to show that there's no smoke and mirrors, if we look on the C drive of this VM, there's currently no tools directory. Right. So let's run this playbook. So we're going to move away from using the Ansible executable, and we now use the Ansible playbook command, and we are going to point at our playbook, demo 1. And so because I've specified which hosts we're targeting in the playbook, of course, don't need to tell it here, but we do need to tell it where the inventory is, and also to ask for the password. That's the bit that the configuration, if we got to that, was going to stop us having to do, just as a spoiler. All right. So the first thing it does, unless you tell it not to, is gather facts, as you can see there. It's just going off and getting a bunch of system information about the host, which you can use in later steps. And the output there, you can see OK or green means I've done the thing, I didn't change anything. In this scheme, it's sort of a brown, but orange means I've changed something. Something on the system has been changed because of this command. If I run it again, because it's already been run, we've already created that directory, we already copied that file, everything comes back green because nothing needed to change. And if we look, we've now got our tools folder. We've got our example text file, but those variables weren't substituted in. So the reason was this copy command just takes the file as is and dumps it on disk. It doesn't care about the content, it just dumps it on disk. What we want instead is the win template command, and this is where the Ginger templating stuff comes in. So this command will evaluate those Ginger template syntax things, and that could be loops, it could be conditionals. You can literally generate this file from the Ginger syntax. Of course, we're keeping it simple here and just substituting those variables. But it evaluates it and then dumps it on disk. So what we should see here is we don't need to create the directory, but we do need to change that file. There we go. And if we look at the VM again, we can see that the variables have now been substituted in, and our one that was specific to this host, the Windows Server 2019, the variable overrode the one that was in the the all group. So it is possible. I mentioned there was more precedence for those variables. You can specify in your playbooks variables that apply to this playbook itself. Those will override anything in the host vars or the group vars. And then also when you're running it from the command line, you can pass in extra variables with a -e, and those will override everything. Those take the highest precedence. And I promised a little bit of PowerShell, so very quickly I'm going to do that. As good as all those commands are that are available, eventually you're going to find a hole that there's not an Ansible module to do the thing you want to do. And luckily there is a PowerShell module available, which just allows you to run PowerShell. At that point you can do whatever you want, right? What this module gives you is an automatic variable called Ansible, which allows you to report back to Ansible things like whether or not the script that you ran changed something, whether or not it failed, why it failed, and you can even pass back data. So I mentioned you can capture information from a task. You can basically push out the results via this Ansible thing, and that's what would be captured if you were to capture the results. This specific example here, it checks to see if the NuGet package provider is installed. If it's not, it'll install it and tell Ansible things have changed. And if it's not, it doesn't do anything and says, no, I haven't changed. By default, if you don't do any of that Ansible.changed stuff, Ansible will always report back that a change happened. Of course, it's running a script that doesn't know whether or not something's changed. So what we should see here, this is a brand new Windows VM, so it does need to have the provider installed. So we can see changed. And if we run it again, we see, well, all going well, we see nothing had to be changed the second time. There we go. Because, of course, we're evaluating this if statement because it was false. We didn't have to tell. We didn't have to change everything, and we told Ansible such. So, that is that for the demo. Unfortunately, a little bit truncated, but I'll include the full, the bit that I had to cut. I'll include that in on the GitHub repo when I push all this through to the PowerShell, well, to the conference repo. So where to from here? The main thing I want to encourage is just have a go. Don't let the fact that you need to use Linux, don't let that be a barrier to having a go with Ansible. Forgot where else I was going to go with that, but yeah, have a go. You'll learn to love YAML, and no, you won't. I've had troubleshooting sessions that have been multiple hours that have come down to a bad indent. So get yourself a indent highlighter in VS Code, and it'll help. I've also been using Ansible as an excuse to learn Linux more, and I've been really enjoying that. So, yeah. I do have a bunch of resources listed at that address, toast.click/Ansible. I've listed a bunch of docs, a bunch of suggested reading. I will also say, if you didn't see it prior to this, when the videos go up online, have a look for Stephen Judd's talk on using Linux with PowerShell, because that's a great resource for getting stuck into Linux as a Windows first admin. So we have, well, my clock was slow when we started, so I'm not sure if we actually have a couple of minutes for questions, but are there any questions? Yo. So the question was, what about automating those playbooks and that sort of thing? So I did include that at the end of the next talk, but where to from when you actually start to use this in an organization, you'd be looking at tools like AWX, which is the open source version of Ansible Tower, which now became Ansible Automation Platform. Or there's a community tool called Ansible Semaphore, which basically is they're all basically platforms where you can, well, I'll talk about AWX specifically. You can pull into that your inventory, you can pull into that your playbooks, and then you can schedule and run them from there. And then you've got a central view of what things are running, what things are failing. You end up using things like execution environments, which are containers that these jobs run in. So there's quite a deep world once you start going into it. Yeah. Anything else? Yes. So the question was, does that PowerShell have to be inline? So it doesn't, but I've always done it inline. And that's just because how I've worked with it so far is if my PowerShell's gotten too long, I probably should break it up into multiple tasks. But that's just a how I work thing. So I haven't actually gone and done the referencing a file thing. One thing that you might have to do is, because the command's running on the remote machine, you may need to copy the PowerShell script first and then execute it on the machine rather than, yeah. So I'm not 100% sure, but it is possible. All right, I think we're on time now. So if there's any further questions, come find me afterwards. If you can't find me around, do get in touch online and please review the session.